Every story has to have a cinematic point of view. And if we were going to be telling a Hannibal Lecter story, one of the things that was necessary going into this was that we had to have a very specific design element to the show. And if we were talking about a man's descent into madness, we had to communicate that visually. I wanted to make sure, as a fan of sci-fi and fantasy and horror, where we get to leave the bounds of reality and see things that don't exist in our world, I wanted a gateway to be able to have those kinds of images on the show.
It starts with whatever the writers imagine. We'll have a meeting early in the pre-production process where we discuss with the executive producer, Brian Fuller, and with the episode director what they might be looking for and what story they're trying to tell.
With the visual effects, we took the approach of doing as much as we possibly could in camera and then spending time on the things that we couldn't do in camera.
That all starts in pre-production. In a lot of television series, visual effects will have a meeting with the producers and the key creatives, and then special effects and prosthetics will have a different meeting.
On this particular show, we often hold all of our meetings together so that the different areas of effects, practical special effects, prosthetic effects, and visual effects will all meet together and be in the same room with Brian and the director.
We can come up with something where we use a bit of our talents and a bit of their talents and mix them together and come up with a better effect.
We had to find a way, going into the first episode, that we could deliver great-looking imagery that felt real, because here's the thing, if you're doing a thriller, horror, the moment the bad effect is there, you pull the audience out of that suspension of disbelief. You had them at the edge of the seat and they flip back.
The idea of enhancing the storytelling with visual effects in subtle ways when we need to do something that is just a touch or a flavor of something surreal happening that gives an unsettling feeling for our protagonist, it helps bring the audience into a madness.
Certainly David was very clear in what he wanted to see, and Brian was very clear in what he wrote, so that we had a guideline to begin producing ideas from.
It's always very important with Hannibal, the tableaus of the death scenes. And in doing those tableaus, it's a combination then of the visual effects coming into what has the prosthetics already done.
Will Graham's first exposure to Hannibal Lecter's crime was finding a young woman impaled on a severed stag head being pecked by ravens. And that became his psychic representation of that image, was to see the stag head and the ravens pecking at it and amalgamate those two elements and create this black raven-feathered stag that became this haunting image that plagued Will. And really what that was is this little voice in the back of his head saying, something is strange here, like this is still alive, this is around me, there is an element of horror that I can't escape, and it's pervasive.
The idea of the stag was David Slade's in the first episode, and that has evolved.
He was in the first draft of the script. There was an image that Brian had written that was a dream image, and I liked it a lot, but I knew it was going to be really hard to do it. And we talked about everything. We talked about every way of doing it, from augmenting a real animal to all kinds of things. And in the end, it was a funny little chance reunion I had with a visual effects artist called Sean Broughton, who at the time was at a company called Smoke and Mirrors, and they made this amazing, completely 100% CGI animal. The assets then got passed on to Rocket Science now. So episode 1 and 3, all the animation was done by Smoke and Mirrors. And then after that, the stag that was already built was handed to Rocket Science, and Rocket Science did the great animation for other episodes.
We did a number of shots showing the stag walking away from Will, or kind of looking back at him, sort of leading him to another location, or just sort of taunting him.
We will work with our character animator to produce an initial version which has rough animation, I guess is the best way to put it. It's a first pass. It's produced reasonably crudely. It's almost like a wireframe animation, which we will then show to David and the producer team to get notes on.
All of those shots were basically done by shooting live action plates of Will, and in all cases, instead of using green screen, we would rotoscope Will and place the stag in the shot using 3D tracking, 3D animation and rendering techniques.
And then we'll go through the process of adding the feathers, which is a separate, distinct process, and then rendering at a level which can be reviewed by David and the production team as close to final.
In creating the Raven stag, we go through a process of how many feathers to put on the stag before it becomes goofy. And finding that balance. Whenever you're creating a creature, you have to create it with a certain ominous air because you want it to be powerful and you don't want to give its power away by overdoing it a bit. So we were very careful about how many feathers and where those feathers needed to go on the stag for it to be magical and mythical without becoming a fantasy creature.
I was very nervous for a while until we did some great tests and we became very, very happy with our CGI stag.
One of the things that visual effects does for us is helps us get on the air. So sometimes we film something that may be too much for broadcast television.
You can have people being decapitated, their bodies cut open, but if you show their naked bums, no way.
Coquillas, which was directed by Guillermo Navarro, we had our killer was someone who was making angels out of people, and he would flay them down the middle and spread the flesh out so it looked like angel wings.
That was fine, but they were also nude.
We had this fantastic shot coming into this hotel room where these people had been staged at their desks. Yet we had nudity because their bums were bare and you could see their cracks. So that became unsuitable for broadcast television, and we got a note that we can't show this shot, which was this beautiful cinematic shot. And I was like, we have to show this shot. It's gorgeous. It's a money shot. That's our show.
We ended up covering their backsides with blood.
And I was like, what if we filled that butt crack with blood so you actually couldn't see that there was a crevice? And they said that would work. And so Rocket Science came in and they carried the blood down over the butt crack and filled it up so you didn't actually see a crevice, and we were able to broadcast.
There's no accounting for that kind of taste, I suppose. But hey, it fed into the look of the show, and the imagery was actually, despite sounding really disgusting, kind of beautiful.
This is my gift to you.
Our minds, which are the most sophisticated virtual reality system known to man, is the way to communicate a man's descent. And Will Graham's story in the first season is about his descent into madness. So we needed a cinematic vocabulary to communicate that.
Months of thinking and planning went into Will Graham's decriminalization process. How things would disappear from scenes.
That effect was initially described as a pendulum in Will Graham's mind. It was not sort of fully established when we began production on episode 2. It was still being worked on the pilot.
We worked together with Smoke and Mirrors to develop the pendulum effect for reversing time. And then we worked out how we would do some of the specific moments.
So in each case, we tried to figure out what shots of a particular crime scene could be presented as a time rewind.
The way we did it is lots of different ways, but all meticulously planned, well in advance. Lots of meetings with special effects.
So the moments that we worked out for the pilot often involved reverse high-speed photography, blood spraying against a wall and then reversing backwards, or stepping through the moments of the murder scene from Will's POV, but doing some of them in reverse or with a creative visual treatment.
Most of that stuff is done in camera and then cleaned up digitally, but the process of approaching it was something that was heavily tested. So, we had a thing called a dingus. The dingus was a 1 foot kinoflow, which would be swung over the back of the camera, so that the light that's going to be there, and it's not going to be there when we see it, but it's going to be there digitally later, is actually reflecting light into the room. Something that has to be thought about, something has to be planned, something has to be built, it has to be tested, it has to be shot.
So in episode 2, we set a camera up over the Grizzly Mushroom Field crime scene, and we started removing bits and pieces progressively. We had the actors start in the shot and then leave, and then we started removing mushrooms and emptying the grave of the guy in the foreground. That gave us enough pieces to create this time rewind effect where the mushroom field changed over time during the pendulum effect. We enhanced that with some CG mushrooms as well.
It's a lot of stuff, and it's, you know, and it grows and it changes, but the one thing I can say about that stuff is it's a lot of planning, really. The bit where you're doing it is never the kind of bit where you're worried, and that's the kind of like, okay, now it's quite methodical.
One of the wonderful things about working with the visual effects team is that they can augment our production value in a relatively cost-effective way that gives us things that don't exist. So for instance, in the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, we have a relatively modest building, but we need it to look like an institution.
Creating environments or altering environments is a very common visual effects technique in general. It's something we do all the time for lots of shows. We shot an existing building in Toronto. Just the front part of the shot is a real building. The entire back structure is a visual effects matte painting.
So they enhance that little building into a large kind of behemoth building that has an oppressive quality to it. That is where the criminally insane are stored to protect society.
That was challenging because a lot of the exterior shots that were done, a lot of the establishing shots that were done for Hannibal were shot time-lapse, basically with a still camera that took images over several hours where the light is constantly changing. The sun might be going in and out of clouds, the sun's moving across the sky over the course of the shot, and it was a challenge to replicate that lighting on a matte painting.
But again, it's constant dialogue with rocket science, talking about how we always discuss how we're going to do all the visual effects shots. I generally have a very clear idea of how I'm going to do a shot, and I discuss it with them, make sure they're okay with it, and then they get all the things that they need, and then we go and we do it in a way that can be expedited for television.
We're very dedicated to doing a quality production, and so it's vital for us to not put anything on screen that we can't defend.
It's funny when you think that it's a heavy visual effects show, it's like you don't think it is, because everything is pretty seamless.
Visual effects has always been a fascinating part of any filmmaking process for me. Going back to classic science fiction films, the process of delivering an image to an audience that does not exist in reality is fascinating because we're giving them something that they can't ever see without sitting in front of their television or going to a film.